Start recording. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our presentation tonight. My name is Jenna White. I'm the current Vice President of Communications for the Fairfax County Council PTA. Tonight, we're presenting Empowering Safer Kids, No Helicopter Required. And our presenter this evening is Laurie Tasharski from SCAN of Northern Virginia, Stop Child Abuse Now. Laurie is the Director of Institutional Abuse Prevention. Laurie also facilitates the Allies in Prevention multi-disciplinary child protection teams, and she facilitates the Loudoun Trauma-Informed Community Network. She works with international child protection professionals, develops comprehensive safety programs for organizations, and has developed professional development and has delivered professional development in more than 40 countries. So Laurie is going to talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we wanted to leave plenty of time for question and answer. So go ahead, you can start putting them into the Q&A at any time as you think of them, or please be ready at the end for some questions and discussion. So thank you so much, Laurie, for this information, and I'll hand it over to you now.
Thank you, Jenna. I thought you might include in my bio that you and I have had lots of conversations, and I had many conversations with Hamid as well, and your other colleagues at the PTA about issues that impact children. And I do want to thank everyone who's joined us. You are people who care about kids, your caregivers and parents, your professionals, but remember too, you're also aunties and uncles and neighbors. Most of us are surrounded by children in our lives who may see us as askable adults. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of SCAN for taking, a hot second to learn a little bit more so that you can uphold that trust that children may have in you in many different aspects of your life, whether you're a coach or a volunteer. I do thank you for that. So just so you know that you're in the right place, this is presented by the Fairfax County Council of the PTA, and I thank them so much for their invitation. And I want to point out that this is a no fear zone. None of us parent at our best when we're scared. Most of us don't think very well or plan very well when we're scared. And so I'm going to do my best to really focus on positive things and strengths and things that you're already doing that are helping empower your children to be safer. One of the things I like to do is start a conversation from a place of shared values. The space that we occupy now has become quite fragmented, and many times it feels that we're on different sides. I think child protection is an area that we should all be on the same side because it does require all adults to keep children safe. So if you have a mobile phone or other device handy and can grab this QR code, I'm going to do it just so that I know you've had enough time. Grab the QR code. You could also go to menti.com and put in this voting code, and go ahead and, if you would, put in some of the values that you hope to teach your children, things that you are hoping that your children will take on as they become youth and young adults. And I'm just going to put a couple in, and then I will also go over here to share the results. Leah, are you able to share my screen? Let's just minimize this. Okay. And we've got some answers here. Please keep them coming. You can respond more than once. So the universal values that we want our children to learn, I'm seeing respect in there quite a bit, truthfulness, being honorable, inclusion, expressing inclusion, the values of being hopeful people, persistent people, empathetic people, working hard, being independent, trying trying to read that one. Kind, and you can keep those coming. I think it's really helpful to understand, and certainly one of the things I want to share is that there are certain universals, and that is the basis of the work that I do as a professional in rights-based child protection. So thank you for participating, and I'll share that with you at the end. I am from SCAN of Northern Virginia. We are a survivor-led rights-based child protection organization. That can be a little confusing. That's child advocacy. It's a little different from child welfare. Folks that work in child welfare are pinned to a law at a specific moment in time. And of course, laws change. They reflect lots of different things going on in societies. But as a rights-based child protection organization, our true north are children's rights. And I am going to just take a moment. We are a nonprofit, and let my colleague Leah Thornton just make a little pitch for later in the presentation, and you can grab the QR code now. We are going to ask you to evaluate what you're observing tonight and what you might be learning tonight. Leah?
Thanks, Laurie. So as a nonprofit, we rely heavily on grant funding. And so this evaluation that is down in the bottom right, it just gathers some information for grant reporting. So every question that's on there is because a grant is asking us about it. It takes probably no longer than 2 minutes. And so if you are interested in supporting us in that way, taking that evaluation is very helpful. So thank you. And we will have the QR code again at the end if you miss it.
Thank you so much, Leah. I need to be sure you know that in addition to institutional abuse prevention, which is what Leah and I do, which is working with organizations that serve children on their duty of care to keep children safe and promote protective factors, we also do parenting programs and coaching. We have a court-appointed special authority in 2 counties here in Northern Virginia, and we do public education as well. The heart of child protection really is, how do I keep this child safe from harm? And I just want to let you have a moment to think about what safety really means, what you are thinking about when you think about safety. And of course, this is conditional. It depends upon the age of a child. If like in the image, you are trying to keep that child safe as they learn to ride a bike, then safety includes some things like helmets, or maybe knee pads, or maybe a parent holding onto the back of the bike or training wheels until that child gains the skills to ride the bike themselves. But we also know that if that parent keeps hanging on to the back of that bike, it might actually make that child less safe. Safety includes lots of different elements. When we ask this question, and I'm sorry you don't have a chance, you can actually, we have the chat. So if you'd like to put in your thoughts about what safety is from your perspective, and I'll mention some of the ones that are often mentioned. People mention meeting children's needs, of course, not experiencing violence or harm, not growing up too quickly, or being exposed to things that are beyond their understanding or their ability to handle them, being given love, healthy development, access to education and healthcare, being able to make mistakes, so smaller mistakes, so that they can learn when they're faced with bigger challenges, and go forward with skills that they've developed organically. So all of these things make up child safety. The reason we are rights-based, we are linked to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. This was, actually is, the single most successful treaty in human history. The United States was instrumental in it being developed, and it was put into place in the 1990s. Every single country in the world has signed this treaty. The United States is the only country not to have ratified this treaty. But we know and understand that the that children's rights are universal, and this enables us to have conversations around what's harmful without talking about maybe in my traditional culture or in my country or region of the world, this is different. So we can walk forward knowing that there's some shared understandings about, in fact, 57 different rights that children have, and here's just a few of them. But what's important here is that all of these children's rights support a child's healthy development and at its heart prioritizes the best interests of the child. I think it's important to also note qualifiers, and we're hearing a lot about parents' rights. I am a child protection person from a rights-based child protection lens. That means I'm putting children's rights as paramount, but children exist, healthy children exist in families. That's a critical part of a child's healthy development. And so we remember that qualifiers here are things that are in the family's best interest. We understand that rights are non-discriminatory. They're not just for boys. They're not just for rich people. They're not just for one race or one religion. They apply to all children, including those who have disabilities, developmental or physical disabilities. And that there are many, many cultural traditions that we have passed down from generation to generation from our elders that keep children safe. And foster those values that we talked about at the very beginning. But we also understand those traditions require reflection. And in fact, we are learning more every single day about the impact of harm on brain development. And so as we learn new things, we reevaluate those cultural traditions. And that's incumbent upon us as adults. So what are child protection concerns? What are the kinds of things we're talking about? Let me also say that when we say a child, we're talking about a child up to the age of 18 right now. There is a movement internationally to make that a little bit older. But I want to put this here just so that we realize that Virginia law is not our true north. Our true north is this idea of healthy development and the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so it would include all of these things. We also know that some children are more vulnerable to harm than others. Let me also say that all children can be vulnerable based on their age of development. So very young children are more vulnerable. Some children are more vulnerable because they are under-resourced or minoritized. Some children are more vulnerable because of the situations they're in. Maybe they're in a travel soccer team. Maybe they go to an all-boys school. These kinds of environments might increase the likelihood of a child incurring additional or greater wrong. It's never the child's fault that they are more vulnerable to harm. And when I say that, I include, of course, children with disabilities, children from racial minorities, and any child that has a stigma around their identity. So that would include LGBTQ+ children. So what does abuse or harm include? Well, we know that, and probably most of you who are here know that it covers physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. What does that look like in an organization? Physical abuse, excuse me, I dropped my glasses. Physical abuse really includes any kind of harm or risk of harm that to me is all but the most minor. Again, we're not talking about the law here. We're talking about things that might harm children, and every child is different. How they react to harm and trauma is very unique to them. So we might look at something and say, well, that's kind of a low level or a lower level sort of type of harm, but we still need to mitigate those risks and think about as well that physical abuse might include things like sustained physical exercise or exertion, or sustained physical immobility. So, making a child kneel, making a child, sit in one place and not move for hours on end, or run and run and run. Those might be included in physical abuse. Sexual abuse is really always referring to a harm that comes to a child, that it lies outside of their developmental ability to understand, but also a society's norms around that child's engagement in sexual activity. We always like to point out that children cannot consent to abuse, and children do test boundaries, you know, and children are sexual beings. And so, of course, sometimes children might cross a boundary. That isn't consent, that might be compliance, but that also might be considered sexual abuse under these definitions. Emotional abuse is actually the most common form of abuse. It is part of all the others. And neglect is the absence of some kind of support that a child needs for healthy development. So in an organization, what that might look like is, you know, on a hot day, children not being allowed to drink water or take a break in the shade. And how these things interact with a child protection agency, all of these things are present in the descriptions on the right-hand side. We look at harsh or absentee parenting. We are concerned about data protection and privacy for children online, online abuse and exploitation, which, you know, now there's an online element to 2/3 of all sexual abuse for children. So abuse isn't just contact abuse. Sexual abuse can happen in a non-contact setting. The sharing of sexual images of children, which is illegal, and very often an increasing number of those images are made by children themselves. We would also look at peer-on-peer abuse and hazing, certainly employee misconduct, children's rights not being affirmed in educational settings because that impacts their access to education, which is one of their rights. We also would think about radicalization, and in fact, too, the over-discipline of minoritized groups, what sometimes is called the school to prison pipeline, but is also the fact that some racial groups and LGBTQ children are overrepresented in harsh discipline in organizational settings. So I want to focus in just a little bit on sexual abuse for a moment. It is more prevalent than most people believe. I will say that I know that we have among us, in any group, we have people who are survivors of childhood sexual abuse and other forms of abuse, and we have the supporters of survivors. I want to thank you for being a supporter of a survivor, and just remind survivors to take care of yourselves as we have this conversation. Sometimes triggers can come in unexpected ways, and our resilience really varies. It's the end of the day. You may not be expecting strong emotions, but they can, of course, happen. So I do want to mention that. So we are closer to parity than not in who is harmed. Of course, that varies by abuse type and age. Boys are more likely to be physically abused, girls more likely to be sexually abused. I think it's really important to remember that peer-on-peer abuse, and I have a statistic to share with you, is about half of sexual harm caused by other outside of the family. And just so that you're aware that in a survey of adults, we found that the majority had experienced some form of abuse or neglect by an employee of their school, and 1 in 10 had experienced sexual misconduct by an employee of their school. Thank you so much for putting information in the chat. I appreciate it. We'll be coming to questions as well, but Jenna will stop me if you have a question pertinent to a slide, Jenna, so feel free to stop me and interrupt me. So when we think about perpetration, and by the way, you may be really well informed, I always like to mention that we're all impacted by social norms. So even those of us who are very clear about, you know, ideal victims or who perpetrators are, we are still influenced implicitly by the social norms around us. So it's important to sort of pull those out and reflect on them. But in fact, the identity of the abuser, sexual abuser by relationship, is in the minority from the family. And what you'll see from this rather complicated slide, is that in fact it's majority acquaintances, and this is actually a lower percentage than we usually see. Around 80 to 90% of people who harm children sexually are acquaintances. But you'll see here that juveniles, other than boyfriends and girlfriends, which is that stat a little above, about half are of the harm from this study. And by the way, this study was not, was in 2016, and it was taken in 2000, 2008, and 2016. So this is a longitudinal study. One of the things that was quite surprising for those of us that do institutional abuse was that actually children who experience harm in an organization have a worse outcome, have a harder time recovering from that harm than even children who are harmed in a family. This is a little counterintuitive, but I think if we unpack it a little bit and we think about how important scouting is, how important soccer is, how important our faith communities are, we realize that children being harmed in those environments impacts a huge part of their lives and what's important to them and their trust and how they engage with the world. So I did promise Jenna that I would talk about a few myths. I kind of pictured this as like Family Feud, top 5 myth. But I also want you to think a little bit about the impact of those myths. So some of these you may know. You may also need to move my face if it's blocking the text. I would say the top one is that it's sort of two sides of the same thing. Abuse is inevitable, and abuse is not serious. When we talk to teachers, I spent a number of years traveling internationally working with educators in schools, and we always hung a flip chart in the high school hallway so that young people could answer the questions that we were asking professionals. And we always hung one that said, what are the messages adults send about abuse? And every time we did that, there was some variation of, it doesn't matter, it's not that serious, get over it, or that's the world, toughen up. That's quite shocking. But if we think also about the impact of this idea that abuse is not serious or is inevitable, it means we're not going to respond. We're not going to show up when our kids need us. And I also talked to a lot of groups of young people, including one in Fairfax. And what I heard from them was, yes, we know who to report to. We know the counselor and that we're supposed to tell. The problem is that when we tell, when nothing happens, we know that it doesn't matter. When we don't hear back what was done, that we're either not believed or taken seriously. And then the next time we try to solve it ourselves. And more young people are disclosing on social media because they don't trust the adults who are in their lives. So I just want all of us to be a part of that group of adults who young people can trust. And I'll talk a little bit about disclosure in just a minute. The other one that I hear a lot, and I even hear this from educators, is that kids make stuff up. Children actually make up stories that make them look good and heroic. They make things up to get out of trouble. They don't generally make up stories about things that are shameful. So we also know that kids have an even lower false allegation rate than adults, and the adult rate, according to the FBI, is 8%. So most children, younger ones, it's even lower, run around 2 to 5% of false allegations. In fact, it is far more common for children to then say, oh, by the way, it didn't happen. That's called recanting, and take back an allegation. That is really not at all uncommon. So they're not likely to make a false allegation. I also wonder if you think about these beliefs like people who abuse are monsters or pedophiles. Particularly, I have a problem with this term pedophile. We picture a certain person, and that person doesn't work in our school. If that person doesn't work in our church, that person is probably not our neighbor. People who harm others are pretty much just like you and I. And as you now know, they are also young people themselves. The impact of that, of course, is that we don't believe children who tell us that someone that we trust and like, who's creative and talented, harmed them. We tend not to believe our kids. Men and boys are perpetrators and girls are victims. Actually, girls are more likely to have problematic sexual behavior under the age of puberty. They're more likely to have more victims or harm more other children than boys. Boys are more likely over the age of puberty to harm, but they typically harm only a fewer number of children. And then once you get to adulthood, yes, men are more likely. I would say, however, that we think it's closer to parity than not. And a part of the factor that we see is that boys are less likely to report. And then finally, I think this is an important myth to talk about, is that my child will tell me. I shared that belief. I was certain that my child would tell me, and they didn't. So I just want to say that it's important to identify other adults, to get those communication lines open, have your child be used to telling you when they make mistakes, and have a way of dealing with mistakes that doesn't punish them, that helps them learn consequences, but also keeps that door open for them to tell you about something, because very often people who harm children make sure there's a rule broken somewhere along the way so that children are less likely to disclose. I do want to move on a little bit faster, just to talk about what you can do. And certainly if you live in a household where healthy boundaries aren't observed, perhaps you post images of your child without their consent, or there are threats, or I think immediately of a case where I was in a coffee shop, and a mom obviously knew the barista, and every time the barista walked past her child, he tapped her child on the shoulder, and so he would look, and then he would go by, and when he'd come back again, he'd tap her or touch him. And finally, after about 10 minutes of this, every time the waiter went by, the little boy was sort of wiggling in his chair and like looking unhappy. He said, "He keeps touching me." And the mom said to him, "It's okay, he's our friend." And just knowing that there are even, obviously no harm was happening there, but that child's body autonomy was being violated. That child had a right to consent, and also needed support of that parent to speak up and say, "I don't really like this game," or "I don't like this game," whether it's a tickle game or something else. "I don't feel like giving a hug," being able to say hug or high five. I do want to mention foster help-seeking behaviors. I think it's a beautiful trend in parenting right now, which is to foster independent kids and ask them to figure stuff out by themselves or on their own. It's empowering, but there are times when help-seeking is important in their lives, and we know this is a protective factor. So if you've asked them to figure something out and they do that by asking for help from someone else, don't see that as something harmful. See that as something protective, and call out and compliment, and let your kids know that you also seek help when you need help. I'm going to move on because we're going to talk a little bit more about paying attention and being curious. I'm going to give you a few conversation starters. If there are parents of boys out there, one of the big tips for boys is to keep them moving. It's much easier to have a conversation with them if you're taking a walk or you're throwing a ball. Certainly, many of you will have already figured out that having them in the back seat of a moving car means that they're more likely to share information. Certainly, if you are always seen to be taking over, they may not want to tell you their problems. So sometimes perhaps practice being a sounding board. That means you validate, don't relate. Just let them share with you. Control your emotions. We like to ask you to avoid why questions because they feel kind of blaming. And also give you permission to say, you know what, this is an important question. I don't have an answer right now. Could I come back and talk to you later? But I'm glad you told me. I'm glad you told me that. I need a little time to think about that, and I'm going to come back and give you an answer later. Because sometimes what we're asked can really shock us, and we need to be prepared to have things change by what our children tell us. And certainly anytime you're highlighting their strengths, thanking them for asking you, admiring the courage that it took to talk to you, all of those things are positive for having children be more likely to share with you. And that's what research tells us. Your school has a duty of care. These are some of the pieces that are a part of their duty of care. They take different shapes in schools. And when schools fail their duty of care, what we call that is institutional enabling. Any organization that fails to report or support the recovery of a child that's been harmed, or to take seriously their prevention responsibilities, may be enabling harm. So we know that there are people who've harmed in organizations, and they can harm in this one and that one, but not the other one. And so when we ask questions about why that happened, very often what they will say is, I didn't have the opportunity, or, things were in place, policies were in place, staff were activated, children were engaged, parents were engaged, and I wasn't able to target a child in that particular organization. So an institutional enabler, we don't want to throw that word around and make it mean nothing. We want to be very clear about what that means. That would be an organization that has an obligation to act, that despite any remorse or sadness they feel for the victim, they are also enabling recovery, keeping that child safe, taking concerns seriously, mitigating risk, and understanding that they have a responsibility to prevention as well as response. There are some strategies we very often see when we see organizational enabling. There's a few listed here. This is the kind of answers that you might hear, excessively legalistic answers. Very often what we see is saying, well, this is not our obligation because it happened, on a Friday after school and school was closed for the day. So narrowing their obligation or their scope of duty. And also another thing we see is making it sort of exceptional. Well, it was this one person, they were able to exploit the rules or break the code of conduct, and it's not happening, or it's not possible for it to happen again or with someone else. Finally, I did, really, this is the last bit about institutional enabling. I did want to have a chance to mention the sort of don'ts and do's around responding to disclosure. I think a lot of parents are interested, and certainly keeping in mind that you have, your kids' friends and, relatives that might also disclose to you. It can be sometimes hard to identify the process of disclosure. Sometimes it's testing, so they're waiting to see your reaction. So some of the don'ts, and this might be a little instinctive, so spot on if something I've said is something you're thinking right now, is don't overreact. We hear from survivors, victims and survivors, that very often the response of their parent or the person they told was more traumatizing than the harm itself. So if you need to leave the room to compose yourself, do that. Just tell the child why you're leaving, thank them for telling you. One really important thing for parents is we really advise you don't go searching for images unless you have a reason to suspect or your child has disclosed to you. It's a violation of their privacy, and you may see something that that traumatizes you as well as your child. So do not view sexual images of children. If your child says, look what I just received, ask them what it is they're showing you. Is it a friend, what another child sent, and ask them to describe it. It's also illegal to possess or share sexual images of children. I would also say don't assume you've heard all of it. If they tell you, usually they tell just a little bit. That's why it's called a testing disclosure. And I wouldn't interrupt either with too many questions. This is something I'm really, really bad at. I want to know everything. I want to know it immediately. And I don't want you to stop talking until I've asked you every question I have. It's much more effective for young people to just hear silence, and then they will kind of naturally want to fill that silence. So if you think there's a disclosure, your kind of go-to question is, oh, could you talk about that a little bit more? Tell me a little bit more about that. I'm not really understanding what you mean by that. That's one of the things that you need to do. Of course, your do's are take it seriously. Even if it's a boundary crossing, there could be more, and we want to prevent harm, of course. So if they tell you that my coach is always texting me, or I didn't sleep because I was talking to my coach last night, these are the kinds of boundary crossings that we'd want you to follow up with. Always thank them for telling you. Don't make promises you can't keep, such as not telling anyone. Give them as much agency and control as you can. You're going to have access, I believe, to these slides. Jenna, correct me if I'm wrong. These are, or you can take a picture of it if you want. These are a few conversation starters. Basically, the themes here are, helping your children learn how to name and frame their emotions, so that, as they get older, understanding what it is that they're feeling, giving them the opportunity to have body autonomy, teaching them some nonverbal cueing. This is a huge part of consent and body autonomy. So this is where you see they look sad because, they aren't engaged, they aren't playing with you. Or what makes you not want to play with someone else? Or how can we tell that a child is saying no, even when they don't say no? What does that look like? Does it look like pulling away? Does it look like stopping talking? Does it look like not making eye contact, shaking a head? All of these things are things children need, these cues that children need to learn when they're playing with other children and when they're with adults. I also want to mention, for those of you who have teens and tweens, even though we're saying the word child, of course, we mean them as well. Really, 20 years ago, we said no means no. 10 years ago, we were saying yes means yes. What we're talking about now is a do no harm orientation. And one of the reasons for that is we realize that there's so much pressure on girls to turn down inappropriate requests or requests for sexual images. So parents of boys in particular, teach them not to ask, because they are doing harm in asking. I worked on a case where a girl and her friends were asked every single day for an entire year for sexual images by a group of older boys. And it turned out to be a exploitation ring. They were collecting sexual images and selling them on the internet. But eventually she was exhausted by their constant asking. And she said, I thought if I'd sent it, they would stop asking. And of course, asking for sexual images could be seen as a form of emotional abuse as well. So there's a short video I would love to share with you. I may have to optimize for video real quick. Jenna, are there any questions that I need to address while we're...
No, not yet. So feel free, excuse me, if you have questions, you can start putting them in for the next few minutes coming up here.
I'm Lucy. I'm 7 years old, and my mom posted pictures of me on online.
That's good.
I'm Elmer. I'm 18 years old. My mom shares too much about me online.
I'm Zoya. I'm 16 years old, and my mom shares my whole life.
If you're gonna be so worked up about it, then I'll take it down, but I don't agree with you, just for the record. why are we here today?
Talk about the photos.
¿En Facebook?
Yes. You want
¿Por
to-
qué?
Let me show you a few.
This.
What's the big deal? I think you look so cute and it was a nice moment. What's wrong with it?
Yeah, because you didn't ask.
I also think of it as connecting to other people that I know in real life, you know? Like, just think, like, Abu and Grandpa, like, how else do they know about you guys except to see you there?
You can call and FaceTime.
Yeah.
You can do many other stuff to see them instead of social media.
Yeah, that's true. That's a really good point.
By age 5, the average kid has 1,500 photos of them online.
¿Y por esa foto estamos aquí, no?
Technically, yes.
No lo puedes cambiar. O sea, ustedes son mi orgullo, no pueden cambiar nada.
It's a photo where I'm shirtless and I'm not ready for a photo.
Yo pienso que todos los papás hacemos eso. Yo la subo, yo no veo nada malo, tú tienes ropa abajo. Está todo privado y solo mis amistades y mi familia pueden ver todo.
All it takes is one person and one hack, and there goes all your privacy. Remember when I was getting my debit card?
No, pero no puse los números de tu...
No, I know you didn't, but it was like los números, como el address estaba ahí.
No,
printado
ahí no
atrás
está
en
el
los
address.
papeles. Yeah,
No,
los
sí,
papeles,
pero...
Como papeles que dicen mi nombre completo, tú sabes, cosas que son privados.
Posiblemente sí, eso sí, estuvo mal de mi parte.
Okay. By 2030, parents sharing about their kids online will account to 2/3 of identity fraud.
What is everybody so worried about? The sauce on the face photo, like what is it going to do that is like wrecking everybody's life in their imagination?
I think the sauce on the face photo, that's just an embarrassing photo. But, you know, the photo of me in a bathing suit. Someone out there could look at my body and think something of me that I wouldn't want them to think.
But you go on the beach in those clothes, and strangers could take photos of you on the beach and do what they want with those photos.
But you're my parent. You're my mom.
Right. Yeah, I would think about that, yeah.
You would. So now you would say that you would consider.
Maybe. Not really. Unless we stop taking vacations together and stop having good times together, it would actually, honestly, would be depressing if I couldn't document it for Insta. If it's not on Insta, it didn't even happen.
You really feel that way?
Yeah, because, yeah. So do you think kids should have veto power, the ability to say, please take that down, you have to?
I absolutely think that kids should have veto power. And again, it's because of how aware I am of the implications of the digital footprint that I say that. Some facts. In France, kids can sue their parents for sharing too much about them.
I mean, what should I say? They just don't know what they're doing, France.
If I'd asked you about that picture, would you be okay if I posted it?
Yes.
Oh, really? So it's actually about the asking, not about the
Yeah.
picture itself.
Posting any private information or anything online should be my call.
I really try to limit the amount of things I aggravate you with. And if a photo or an upload is causing so much aggravation, is it worth it? It's probably not. So I understand where you're coming from.
So I think we'll take that moment to ask questions. I saw there was something in the chat, and I want to give you the opportunity to comment if anyone would like to. Or is there a question? Are there any questions?
Yeah, we have one question so far, and please keep putting them in. The question is, for elementary age kids, how often should parents plan to discuss these topics? Obviously, it will come up at times, but should we plan to have these conversations regularly?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thanks so much for that question. You may be aware of the Wait Until 8 campaign, which is to wait to give children mobile phones in the 8th grade. We understand that every family is different, every child is different. So part of risk is, do you have a child who's a risk taker? Are you encouraging them to climb the tree or calling them down out of the tree? So, you know, each of your children may be a little bit different. And certainly any conversations you're having with them about, say, for example, their friends should also include their friends online. So if you're asking children about, you know, who are your most creative friends, or who are your friends that you always count on? You always want to be explicit about saying, do you have online friends, and who are they, and why do you like them? And is it because they're great at Fortnite, or is it because they give you skins in Fortnite and they're always buying you, swag, or, those kinds of questions. You want to remember that there's no real world and digital world to our kids. There's just their world. And so be as interested in their online lives as you are in their everyday lives, because you're less likely to know. And it also helps them discern when someone is maybe not good for them. Who gives you confidence, who makes you feel the most yourself, who accepts you, and, be having those conversations frequently, and that will create space and help you convey your values, and also give them openings to share information. And certainly those sentence starters are for different ages, but if you've been having conversations, that means you're far more likely to continue to have conversations, especially hard ones, ones where they can explore ideas and you don't overreact to what it is they're saying.
Laurie, I have a question. Can you talk more about when children don't disclose to their parents? Is there research that says then that they're not likely to disclose to anyone, or would they maybe disclose to a friend or other trusted person when they're not disclosing to their parents?
Yeah. So the older children get, the more likely they are to disclose. The highest disclosure rates are among teenage girls. But we also know that in a recent study, only 6% of children who were asked for sexual images online by someone they knew to be an adult, 6% told a parent. 14% told someone else, usually a peer. So one of the things when we're talking to professionals, we always are saying to them, you need to be attuned to what young people are saying to you about their friends. One, they may be talking about themselves when they say my friend said, but also we need to take seriously the fact that young people are taking their role as supporters quite seriously. They are far more likely to come and talk to an adult to say, a little piece, what they can share without violating their friend's confidence. So you really need to take that seriously. And I do have a little bit more information as well, actually, on professionals for just a note. Professionals here or watching, or maybe you're a coach or you teach Sunday school at your children's at your faith community. Remember that professionalism is protective, so you may be a volunteer, but making sure that you're having children see you in a role. You're not their mom, you're not their friend. You have the privilege of working with them, and you want to channel as much kind of professional boundaries as possible. You really need to start by believing. If we don't believe, we don't tend to take any action. And if you're a professional in an organization, you need to start unpacking some of those social norms and those biases that all of us imbue from Hollywood and from the world around us, preferences we have for people who look and sound like us, the harmful adultification of minority children and LGBTQ children, that is, seeing them as older than they are and attributing adult motivations and behaviors to children, that is just a part of an implicit bias that we might have. And of course, working with your scout troops and your gymnastics studios and your summer camps to advocate for policies and procedures that listen to children, elevate their voice and choice, and include a code of conduct that make sure that professionals and those who are seen as professionals maintain appropriate boundaries with kids. Certainly, we can be thinking about the kinds of things we want to do more, see more, and have more for our children. And knowing that preserving the rights of some children, especially lower resource children, children with vulnerabilities, does not take anything away from children that don't have those vulnerabilities, because of course, all children are vulnerable depending on the situation. And then I just want to finish, Jenna, with to remind parents that taking care of yourself is absolutely a protective factor for children. Saying no when you need to say no to things. Your kids are watching. I'm a middle school teacher, and if there's an age where you feel like you are not being heard, it's middle school. And yet every single day we would see kids come in and say things that were so obviously coming out of their mother's mouth, or their caregiver's mouth, or their grandparents' mouth. They are listening, they're absorbing. So even if they're not responding or they're shrugging you off, understand that they are hearing you and internalizing that and using those things with their friends. Certainly, there is so much help online and locally. I'm going to provide these slides to Jenna to share. Just want to give you an opportunity to remember that 988 is a mental health hotline if you have young people who are LGBTQ+. The Trevor Project hotline is maybe a better way to go there. Self-harm and risk of suicide ideation are at all-time highs, and really our kids want to tell us, they just don't know how, and don't have the opportunity. So don't be afraid to ask. As Leah pointed out, we were going to give you another opportunity to grab this QR code, but I also want to open it up for any additional questions that you might have, or that you might have, Jenna.
Yeah, feel free, everyone, to put more questions in the chat. I will definitely be sending out the slides and a recording. I do have another question. When you mentioned gymnastics, it reminded me that when my son was participating in gymnastics, as the headlines were coming out about that case, the owner sent out their policy. I don't know if it was new or in response to that, or if it was more internal up until that time, but I really appreciated an email with a PDF that said, here are all of our policies. So is that something like, let's say we join a new martial arts studio, that's something that I think I should think of to ask for if, let's say, a small business owner or a small sports league doesn't have something like that, where could they go to create the policies that they could have both for employees and then to hand out to parents to create that document that we want to see?
It's a great question, Jenna, and I love that you're asking me that. I think sometimes we say, ask what's the professional code of conduct, or what are the rules about, communicating with my child? How are you going to let them know if the game has changed or been rained out? Those can be hard questions to ask. There's certainly a certain amount of information you can get from a website, seeing what they say about volunteers and how they're hired. We're certainly working with organizations to ask them to put more out there online. And I think you make a really good point about what's sort of like a minimum standard. I think if you're observing and you have your radar on and open and up, there's a lot you can see just by watching how adults are interacting with kids. So are coaches giving kids options, high five or hug, or, certainly anyone who's saying you can't ever touch a child appropriately is trying to sell you something. You can have authentic, warm relationships with children that are professional and don't harm them. And when I mention that you might see something that makes you uncomfortable, that can also be a hard conversation. And I would say that if we frame it, it's not as if I think you're going to harm that child. It's just confusing for my child that that boundary was crossed when other professionals in their lives don't cross that boundary. So pointing out to volunteers, and it may be a Sunday school teacher or it may be a coach, that their behavior is going to impact what's normal for your child. So if they're texting your child, one of the things, you can sort of take a circle way around and say, I'd like to be included anytime you're texting my child, because, they're super forgetful, or, but if that persists and you learn that someone is communicating with your child, even after you've asked them to include you in the thread, then that's time for you to speak up to someone in a position of authority. But also, we are happy to speak with any organizations that you work with. If you would like us to reach out and say, what are your policies? We're here to support you. We have templates, sample policies. Certainly, if it's in the recreation area, Safe Sport is a great resource. And SCAN has a number of resources on our website under institutional abuse prevention. And there's a number of resources also for talking to kids, for talking to your kids about abuse, in our parenting program section of our website. I love that Robert put, do you want to wave, bump, shake, or hug? Yeah, so part of that is just giving kids the choice. And asking questions, being curious about, why don't you want to have that instructor? An aversion to a place or a person, changes in how they interact with their friends or their family, if they have heightened emotions about computers or being online at a specific time. Those are all things you'd want to ask more questions about. Parents have great radar. They know something's going on and something's not right. They just are a little bit scared to ask because we don't want there to be anything wrong. I mean, that's the truth of all adults. We don't want it to be true. We don't want there to be a problem, but we can intercept a lot of harm by asking questions early and helping our child navigate relationships that aren't healthy, or adults who perhaps need a little guidance or coaching on what's appropriate. And frankly, Jenna, what's appropriate for your child might not be what's appropriate exactly for mine. So we really need to be their advocates. And one of the reasons I love working with the PTA and talking to the PTA is you're so amazing at engaging parents and helping them to feel confident in being advocates for their children.
Thank you. Yeah, and when I was thinking about the slide you put up with the resources, which we'll hand out, I don't remember where I got this advice, but someone told me, I do some presentations myself to the Trauma Informed Community Network, to go ahead and take your child's phone and put the numbers in your child's phone and say to them, if you ever need this, it's here, but also you're likely to have a friend that's going to need this, because that way the child felt more comfortable having that information. And one time I gave that out. The next day, the attendee did that, and their child needed it that day. And they said, Mom, I never would have thought it, but you put that number on my phone. I was kind of like, why are you putting this in my phone? I don't have those kind of needs. But then she said, I needed it for my friend. So that's another great piece of advice that I like to pass on, is just go ahead and put it in there for your kids, point it out to them and say, it's very possible that you're gonna have a situation with a friend, and they'll really appreciate if you have this resource ready that you can give to them. So again, we'll hand that out.
I love that. I love that, Jenna. That's fantastic advice. And so often I hear from young people who are supporters of victims, and the anguish they feel is very real, and the secondary traumatic stress that they feel because of their friends' harm. So that is another way for you to keep your children safe, is to let them know that they can talk to you, and that you'll listen, and that you'll help them know what to say when their friend comes to them and says, my parents will, kill me, or, I sent an image and I was told not to, and I'll get in trouble if I tell anyone that I sent the image. One, there is hope. Images can be removed from online spaces. There are ways to anonymously report. So children that are worried about, having their name attached to a sexual image, maybe it doesn't show their face, but they still need it to be taken down. There are many options, and be very attentive to the issue of online sexual harm, because we do see elevated levels of self-harm and suicide ideation for children who are exploited and harmed sexually online. I don't want to end with that. Leah, do you have something you want to add?
Laurie, we had another question come through the chat. I know that we're at time, but I think it's important. And Laurie, I know that you're probably willing to stay and chat just for a minute. So the question that just came through is, how do you have conversations with your kids' friends' parents about their kids towing the line with inappropriate touch with your child? Like, your kid made my kid feel uncomfortable. It doesn't sound like it would go well. And the schools don't really facilitate if it's at school.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. First of all, problematic sexual behavior, and I know you're not saying that your child's engaged in problematic sexual behavior, or even that this was problematic sexual behavior. It is common. There's very low recidivism rates when it's intercepted appropriately and early. So when children are taught the boundaries, when the triggers for inappropriate behavior are identified, very, very few children go on to continue to harm other children or to harm an adult. So, I just want to put hope out there that you have to talk about it. You need to make sure that those children aren't alone together. It depends on the age of the children, of course. I'm not sure of the age that we're talking about here, but talking to your child about advocating for themselves, what it might look like, doing a little dress rehearsal, practicing what you could say, or what, you be the other child and they be themselves, and test out some of that language can be really helpful. Or have house rules and just say, I'd really feel more comfortable if the kids played at my house. For whatever reason. And then you can kind of evaluate how that relationship is going yourself, but certainly teaching your own child possession of themselves. They're the experts on themselves, underlining body autonomy. Most children will take your words and use them with their friends. So, especially younger children, you will very often hear them say something that they never would have said unless an adult had told them to say it, like, I belong to myself. So I do encourage you to, listen to that little voice, and help them trust their gut. Some children are more sensitive than others, but it's really important that we continue to help them realize that they are processing a lot of information, not just what is said. There are nuances in body language. If our gut is telling us that someone is trying to harm us or something isn't right, we really need to make sure our kids are persistent about drawing those boundaries, whether it's a grandparent or a neighbor or a close friend.
And I would just say briefly from the PTA side, our suggestion would be, if it is happening at school, that is something that the parent is definitely entitled to bring up to their teacher. If they don't feel comfortable talking directly to the teacher, bring it to the principal and just talk about boundaries and what you've observed or what you've heard from the child. You could ask questions, about what kinds of things are teachers trained to say at that school, and just start a conversation with them. Because if you're noticing that in your school, I guarantee you other parents are as well. And sometimes once one person starts bringing it up, it can have a huge advocacy ripple effect and really influence positive change, so that children are getting the right messages, or that maybe the teacher needed a little bit more training, or maybe someone else needs to intervene with the principal in terms of how those things are handled at their school.
Very often parents are overwhelmed and scared. There's a huge stigma around perpetration. And so understand that allowing them a chance to learn more about how to intercept behaviors that aren't appropriate. And sometimes they're just caused by anxiety. They're a phase or something a child saw on a movie. Questions can be asked to see if it's a compulsion, to see if it's just a kind of one-off or it's just curiosity. All of those questions aren't going to happen if you don't seek help. and you're modeling for your child help seeking, which is critical for their own protection and recovery from trauma.
Well, Laurie and Leah, I'd like to thank you so much for coming tonight. This is a presentation I know ever since I met you, Laurie, I wanted to bring to FCC PTA, and I'm so glad that we've done it. And hopefully this will just be the beginning of additional information we can provide to parents. The SCAN website is here in the chat. If you haven't already, please fill out the survey. And as we said, we'll be sending out the recording and the slides. And if you'd like to do something specifically at your school, would encourage you to reach out to SCAN directly as well for all of their wonderful programs. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming tonight. And thank you again, SCAN of Northern Virginia, and Laurie and Leah. Good night.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us.